Okay, this is an overview of how to use the Online Mentor training record platform. You go to onlinementor.co.uk unless you are a trainee at one of our client firms with a tailored platform, in which case go to the dedicated URL. In the top right hand corner, you put in your username and password and you're into the system. Let's just take a couple of moments just to sort of orientate ourselves around this content. On the left hand side under categories, the first set of links takes you to our online professional skills content. We also have a couple of links in relation to SRA requirements, including a guidance document that we have put together with a summary of the SRA skills standards and some covering observations that might be useful to consider before actually using the online interface. And when you're ready to use the online interface, the key link is Add Journal Entry, journal being the shorthand for training contract record. The first thing to consider though when you've logged in is changing your password to something memorable, and you do this via Edit My Profile. And by changing your password and by making it more memorable, you reduce the chances of getting blocked from the system by trying to input the wrong password too many times. Okay, let's look at creating training record entries via the Add Journal Entry interface. You can select it from the links on the left hand side, or alternatively you can go to the center of the login page and go in via the, in this case, Test Trainee journal link. And from there you can select Add Journal Entry. And this takes you to the form for creating training contract record entries. And the first thing to consider on that form is date and what date to put in. Usually you can leave that blank, because if you leave that date field blank, it defaults to today's date. And that in most cases will be absolutely fine, because a training contract record isn't really about logging experiences on work done in date order. It's about the date that you actually log that experience. So it's quite possible and perfectly acceptable to be logging today experience that you undertook a week or 2 weeks previously. That's absolutely fine. But if you do want to change the date, for example, if there's a big gap between the date that you create the entry and the time that you did the work, let's say for argument's sake of more than 5-6 weeks or so, then in that situation you may well want to join the timings together a bit more. In which case you can change the date either by using the calendar icon or by manually inputting the date in accordance with that particular date format. One thing that you do have to tell the system, it's the only mandatory field actually in the whole system, is you have to give the entry some kind of title. And in this case, let's say that we're looking into the Brussels Convention. Below that we have period covered fields, and this again is entirely optional. In the vast majority of cases you can afford to leave it blank. The only situation in which period covered may be relevant is if, let's say, you've been working solidly on one particular transaction and a very narrow range of activity for a period of 1 or 2 weeks, where arguably in terms of capturing the experience and your learning points, one entry may be enough, but you want to tell the system, or you want the system to note that actually that one entry covered a long period of time, in which case by all means you can engage the period covered field, but in most cases just leave it blank. Most of the activity will be under work done on the file, matter or case, and the first thing to consider is what practice area is relevant to the work that you're doing. In relation to Brussels Convention, which is to do with governing law and choice of forum, commercial litigation might be the relevant area. The case file matter number field is potentially useful if ever you need to go back to the file to refresh yourself on the work that you did. And you can also specify whether the work was contentious or non-contentious. This is relevant for the SRA because they want to see that you've had a mixture of both contentious and non-contentious work over your training contract, and you can also tell the system who your supervisor was for that particular work. And then we move into the task work done and reflections learning points field. And this is where you are really collating your thoughts and summarizing what you've done and what you think you've learned. But the point to note is it doesn't have to be pages and pages of text. It can be quite short, quite punchy, quite succinct, as in this case. But one thing to note is that reflections and learning points don't necessarily mean what some people think they mean. So I've given you an example here which I would suggest is a bad example of what reflections and learning points are about. Saying that your reflection or learning point is, research and communication skills is really just a kind of very short and rather lazy way of restating your task work done. Saying that you've done research and communication doesn't prove anything. So really, reflections and learning points is about getting to the heart of the learning that was undertaken. So what might that look like? Well, it might look like this, for example, where you could say something like, identified in these cases, in particular, that they turn on their specific factual framework. And from this, it's critical to have a very clear and full set of facts and instructions before formulating advice, and therefore I went back to my supervisor and client several times for clarification. Now this form of words represents reflections and learning points because actually you're taking a step back from the activity. You are identifying things that you observed, things that you learnt, and actually there are some specific learning points here that you have taken away from that particular experience. But again, it doesn't have to be War and Peace. It doesn't need to be a very long and protracted monologue. And below reflections and learning points, we come to one of the USPs of the Online Mentor platform, which is the connection between what you say you've done and what you say you've learned and the appropriate outcomes. For many trainees, this will just be the SRA practice skill standards. Some firms will also dovetail their own KPIs into this interface as well. And what you'll see is that the outcomes, in this case it's the SRA practice skill standards, are arranged in a very logical, very easy to navigate tree structure. And what you then have to try and do is identify within that framework which are the relevant competencies and skills that you've engaged in doing the work that you are logging. And it will take quite a while actually. The first few times that you create training records, training record entries, it will be quite slow going, because this framework of competencies, is not going to just sort of naturally stick in your head. It will take some familiarization before you can navigate your way through that framework quickly. But eventually, that is what happens. And so in the example that we've given in researching the Brussels Convention, we know that it's to do with interviewing, taking instructions and advising. And the most relevant competency here, arguably, is determining what further information is needed. So we'll tick that particular box. And what you'll notice is that next to each competency, there is a number. And that number represents the number of times that particular competency has been ticked in the training contract record so far. So in this particular trainee's training record, there are 2 entries already where they have ticked that they have engaged the competency of determining what further information is needed when taking instructions or interviewing a client. And note that you only have to tick the second level. You don't have to tick interviewing, taking instructions and advising. This is because it's a hierarchical tree structure, and so by ticking the second category, the system understands this is a subset of the main category. Note that occasionally what you'll find is that the SRA skill standards are quite verbose and they go on for quite a while and they get truncated on our system. But the easy way to expand the text is to left click on any of the competencies where perhaps the text has been obscured by the ellipses there, and the full text of that competency will flash up on the right hand side. Now, as well as the interviewing, taking instructions and advising heading, surprise, surprise, the other relevant heading here is research skills. And given what we've said we've done and what we said we've learnt, I think it's appropriate for us to tick all of the research skills boxes here. Which then takes us down to whether we're going to upload files, documentary evidence to support the training records that we are making. Now, this will be dictated to a degree by you, but to a large extent by the firm's policy on whether they want you or are happy for you to be uploading documents to the system. In any event, one thing that you might consider doing is at least describing the document and putting its location into that description field there, so that if either you or your supervisor in due course wants to cross-refer to that particular document, it's easier to locate it on your systems. And having done this, you click enter, and that acknowledges your activity and gives you the option of clicking through to create another training contract record entry. And I'll very briefly just highlight the other key option will be creating records in relation to training or other professional development. And this could be, for example, to do with formal training, for example, the PSC, or it could be internal training of whatever kind, or it could be other professional development activity which isn't necessarily training at all. So, for example, a business development event might be worth logging, and in which case it naturally falls within this heading rather than work done on a file, matter or case. And note that it is possible, if it is practice area specific, to peg it against a particular practice area, and likewise if it's specific to one or more of the SRA practice skill standards, or indeed if this applies your firm's own internal competencies, then you have the option of ticking the boxes accordingly. Okay, let's look at reviewing your training record data. And one way of doing this is via the journal search option, which is available on the left-hand side of the login page, and also via the journal area towards the center of the page. And engaging the journal search will take you to your real-time online training record, and you can see that all the activity, all the entries is arranged there, displayed in reverse chronological order. And you can do a number of things with this data. You can view it by clicking the View Print button, and surprise, surprise, the information which is available to view corresponds exactly to the information that you put in via the user interface. You can also view or print all of the training contract record entries, in which case effectively what you're doing is you're viewing your entire training contract record, which may be something that is useful to do from time to time. Let's say if you are going to have a conversation or mid-seat or end-of-seat review with your supervisor. Note also the options under Outcomes and Advanced Options. Under the Outcomes area, those tick boxes that were available at the Add Journal Entry level become searchable fields in the journal search part of the website. And so by ticking, in this case, drafting, there are 5 entries apparently on drafting, by ticking that box and then going to the bottom right hand corner and clicking Match Entries, the system will go off and find those 5 entries for you. And you could also narrow down your searching by practice area and various other fields if that is useful. The other view into your training record data is via the reports area, and that's, again, there is a link to that on the left hand side of the web page. And you have a couple of options. The most important one is the progression report, and this enables you to run a report on your progression against the SRA outcomes. So clicking the Run Report button will generate a display of the data in a completely different looking form. And so at the top there, what we can tell under SRA outcomes is that there are 10 entries in total in this particular training record which in some way tag one or more of the SRA outcomes. And here you have the option under user comments to provide some kind of narrative, some kind of self-assessment of how you think you're doing. And note below that under reviewer comments that If at your firm the practice is going to be that your supervisor logs in to review your training records online, they also have access to your progression report via their login, and they can add their own comments. If we work through a particular example of how this interface is used, if we go to presentations and advocacy, we can see that there are 2 entries there. Note that that number 2 is a dynamic hyperlink, which if you click will take you through to those 2 entries on your training record, and from there you can review those entries, assess what you think that means in terms of your progression against presentations and advocacy, and provide some kind of user comment there. And in this case, note that we have evidence in the training record of PSC advocacy training and an employment appeal tribunal, but in this case it could be that by reviewing the data in this way you remind yourself actually that you've missed some activity. So here the user is saying, I've also delivered several presentations internally and a presentation at a pitch for tender panel work. So in this case it could be that you go back into the Add Journal Entry interface in order to update your training record accordingly. And note as well, and this again will be either entirely optional or dictated by how the firm wants to use this particular part of the of Online Mentor, you have the ability to grade and sort of self-assess in numerical form your progress, and these numbers are purely arbitrary and they will mean whatever you think they mean or what the firm says they mean. And you can do this for as many or as few of the SRA outcomes as you think appropriate or as the firm requires, and by clicking enter you capture that activity. Note also that you can also click the view print report button on the bottom left, which will open up this form in a print friendly format in a new browser window, and you can print from there. The other point to note is the sign-off report, and if your firm has moved over to sign-off to online sign-off via Online Mentor, then this is where you will see the extent to which your supervisors have logged on and signed off your training contract record. It's worth noting what your managers see and what your supervisors can see through their login. And I've logged in here as a Freeth Cartwright manager. Freeth Cartwright is our oldest client. So from here, note that you can access your manager, your supervisors can access whichever trainees they want to access. And that takes them to their training records in real time. In addition, they have their own version of the reports area where they can run an SRA outcomes report, or in the case of firms that have integrated their own key performance indicators, they can run a report against those. And there is also an engagement report, which shows the managers or the supervisors how active their trainees have been. And this, in conjunction with the monthly reports that we send to our client firms, will keep the firm fully up to date on the engagement levels by you and your colleagues in relation to maintaining and keeping up to date your training contract record. Very quickly, we'll also just have a look at the professional skills content. So the links on the left-hand side on the categories are arranged according to heading. And so, for example, on networking and marketing, what you would see within the contact building and networking module are a list of items which are highly summarized, punchy, condensed items in relation to these particular headings. And if you are a user, if you're a trainee who is engaging with this content for PSC electives purposes, then once you've finished reading the item, you will have to tick the I have read this item box, which in turn engages the Q&As, which in turn you have to answer before clicking submit. If you're not using the content for PSC electives purposes, I would recommend that you don't click I have read this item, because every time that you do, it pings that into your training record, and that won't be relevant for those of you who aren't using it for PSC electives. Okay, we'll finish off by asking ourselves how often we should be logging on. and how many training record entries we should be creating. Well, the expectation is weekly. That's what the SRA expects of trainees. And that's therefore not a bad starting point. And just to put things into context, what we have in mind here is that you would spend probably no more than 20 to 30 minutes per week keeping your training record up to date. In that time, it's quite possible to create several training contract record entries. However, some weeks will be very busy. That is understood. But it wouldn't be right to expect a month to go by, for example, without seeing a trainee create any entries at all. And if that's the case, then of course note that the firm will be tracking and monitoring engagement levels, either themselves through their reports area and or via our own monthly reports on engagement levels. So there are no black and whites, but as a benchmark, the following may be useful. We would suggest that good levels of engagement starts on or around 3 or 4 entries per week on an average basis. Okay might be something like 1 or 2 entries per week, week in, week out, whereas 1 or 2 or less than 1 or 2 entries per week, if that's the average, then really that's poor, and it would raise serious questions in relation to compliance with the core SRA requirements. And that concludes the how-to overview. If you have any questions, then by all means please contact us via the website.